Thank you all for being here, day 2 of TPI Aspen. I realize everybody's had some incredibly lively discussions, and this will be another good discussion point. Just a point of, I was going to say, the publisher prerogative of changing my discussion to surveillance was news to me. So I'm going to do the moderator prerogative of having the discussion that we planned for, which is on cybersecurity and privacy, and we'll throw some surveillance in there because it's always kind of part of the game that comes along, but I promise you will have a lot to talk about. So one thing, because might as well get artificial intelligence mentioned out of the way early. That artificial intelligence and its advancement has brought these two issues of technology policy, cybersecurity and privacy to the forefront of the discussion, which does bring surveillance along for the ride. On one side, AI is becoming a powerful tool for strengthening our defenses, detecting threats, and protecting critical infrastructure. But on the other, it introduces new vulnerabilities and raises important questions about how personal data is collected, used, and protected. This tension between using AI for security and preventing it from eroding privacy shapes today's policy landscape and will be determined on how we decide to balance innovation and public trust in this digital age. But I also appreciate that these are two topics that people on this panel have worked on for a long time, which is cybersecurity and privacy, are finally at the top of our public policy discussions because they're really important. So to discuss this today, I have with me Jeff Green. He's a distinguished fellow at the Aspen Institute's cybersecurity program and has over 20 years of experience in national security and cybersecurity. Most recently, he served as the Executive Assistant Director to Cybersecurity at CISA at the Department of Homeland Security, leading the agency's division during the response to many things, and one of them was the PRC's intrusion into the U.S. wireless providers, which we're going to discuss in a minute. At the start of the Biden administration, he was Chief for Cyber Response and Policy at the National Security Council. He previously directed the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST, and has served as Vice President and Global Government Affairs at Symantec. So just knowing Jeff is a real pleasure for somebody who's been doing cybersecurity for a long time because he just knows so much. And another person that just knows a tremendous amount and is always great to talk to, is Jim Kohlenberger. He is a national technology and innovation policy leader who has served as a senior advisor to 2 U.S. presidents, shaping landmark initiatives to harness innovation in the public good. As Chief of Staff in the Obama White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, he helped drive the transformation on the innovation agenda from advancing national cybersecurity and open data to strengthening Americans' space program and broadband initiatives that we have been hearing about the last 2 days. Early in the Clinton White House, he spent 8 years leading efforts to close the digital divide, establish Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, and advancing children's online safety, which will be another topic that we've been talking about quite a bit and we'll touch on today. Beyond government, he has spearheaded major nonprofit initiatives expanding broadband access, digital learning, and smart city innovation. Today, he serves as the president of JK Strategies, advising organizations in advancing broadband equity and criminal justice, transparency, and trustworthy AI. And Jennifer Huddleston is a senior fellow at the Technology Policy at Cato. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law, with particular interest in the interaction between technology and the administrative state. Her work covers topics including antitrust, online speech, content moderation, and data privacy. Jennifer has worked on these issues in many great institutions that we all really enjoy working with as well. She was an adjunct professor at George Mason University, at the Antonin Scalia Law School. She was policy counsel at NetChoice, and she was the director of technology and innovation policy at the American Action Forum, and as a research fellow at the Mercatus Center. So to kick off this conversation, Jeff, let's start with something that was a wake-up call for a lot of people about many issues, the issue of Salt Typhoon. Let's just give us a basic on what happened, and then kind of what your recommendations were, both at the time when you had the position at CISA and what you would say now.
Great. Thanks, Shane. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. TPI has been an amazing couple of days. Before I jump in, I just want to echo a point you made, that from my perspective through the various jobs I've had, I've always viewed security and privacy as the flip side of the same coin. And I think it's important that we view them together as we drive a pro-privacy agenda going forward. So Salt Typhoon itself, that's an industry term that describes a People's Republic of China hacking group. not something we used widely inside the government, but it's taken hold as a title. I just encourage you to think about Salt Typhoon as a group that has conducted a variety of activities. What I'm going to talk about now is an intrusion into the wireless backbone of the United States that we detected. It's hard for me to pin the dates down. It was a bit of a crazy time, but it was either late summer or very early fall of last year. So along with some private sector partners, we, the government, were able to share some information that we had seen, some activity we had seen with private sector partners. They were able to detect malicious activity on their network, and we were pretty much off and running. As with most of these things that happened on a Friday, ended up ruining the weekend. Most of the press leaks happened on a Friday. It seems to be the way things were wired, at least for this activity. So this group had burrowed fairly deeply into the wireless backbone of the United States, a variety of different companies. Many of them are named. Each victim, and I encourage you to think of them as victims, they are not bad actors in this situation. Each of the victims, though, was differently situated in terms of how far in the PRC got, whether they were just popping in and out. There were some very big names that you can read about. And then there are some very small parts of the overall ecosystem that even we in the government were surprised to realize how centrally positioned they were. Unfortunately, the Chinese had figured that out, which is why they had targeted them. And some were names you never would have heard of. So it was providers and infrastructure companies. This activity was entirely on private sector networks. This intrusion, we never detected anything on a U.S. government network. Unfortunately, because of what they were able to do, they really didn't need to get onto anyone else's network to be able to collect information. So what they were able to do because of their positioning were a couple of different things. First, they exfiltrated call information, call data. There's no easy descriptor of it, not content, but they did that for a large number of devices and calls. Public reporting will tell you that it was primarily in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area. They were also able to target individual devices. Again, you can read some of the names of the people who were targeted. We did acknowledge publicly that we saw targeting of some fairly high-profile people. It doesn't get higher profile. So if the actor is able to connect a device to a person, that's how they get to the person. It's not like they said, we want to get at Jeff Green's phone. They had to know my device. Then they could target it on the cell providers' networks. The final thing they did was access parts of some of the providers where they stored what's called CALIA information, that is lawful intercept information, and they were able to exfiltrate significant volume of that. So this was deep, broad access, probably gained over a long period of time, persistent, very hard to mitigate, in part because many of these networks were put together over the course of years, if not decades, because of mergers and acquisitions. It makes it very hard to mitigate and to even detect. In terms of the recommendations for the telcos, we put out, along with our U.S. government partners and many of our international partners, a hardening guidance that, if followed, would kick out most of the activity and detect additional future activity. And I think fairly recently, the head of the the FBI's Joint Cyber Center, the NCI JTF, said that they believe they have fully kicked out this particular intrusion. For individuals, there's not a lot you can do because there's no malicious activity on your device, and there's no intent or effort to compromise your individual devices. So you do what you can, and I got in a bit of trouble for saying this on a press call, but our simple advice was encryption is your friend, whether it is in messaging or voice calls. Find a way to use an encrypted device. That way, even if the adversary is on the network, and even if they target you individually, absent the post-quantum encryption problems we talked about yesterday, your information would be held private. That was a bit controversial inside the government, and if we have time, I can talk a bit about how we got to the point where we were willing to anger some of our government counterparts in order to say these things. But really, that was our key recommendation, is make sure you're using an encrypted device, you're keeping it as updated as possible, and control what you control. So that was about it. And we gave that advice internal to the U.S. government and externally. Much of it leaked out. There are things individuals could do to harden their devices. You know, Apple has their, I'm blanking on the name of it, but they have a setting you can put that will harden your device. But again, for this type of activity, the biggest thing you needed to do was make sure that your data was encrypted, because if it was compromised, it was going to be compromised on someone else's system.
So before I actually met Jeff, I heard that comment in the media, and then when I finally met him, I'm like, oh, you're that guy. Good for you. You said the part out loud that no one in the government had ever said out loud before. So, Jim, following up on that.
Yeah.
So, why do we have this friction with encryption, knowing how important it is, and with law enforcement?
Well, look, I think we're at a turning point. And I listened to the last panel on broadband. And in broadband, I think we all know broadband is a good thing. The only question is, how do we make it more ubiquitous? And I think now increasingly that's the moment, at least here in the US, where we're reaching, in part after this Salt Typhoon hack, is, we increasingly recognize its value. The question is, how do we make it more ubiquitous? And if we think about it, every day we rely on encryption in important and powerful ways. Every website we go to, if we're making a credit card purchase, we rely on it to help protect that credit card information. On our text messages, we rely on encryption to make sure that only the intended recipient is able to read that message. We rely on our phones to make sure that if it's lost or stolen, our data is still protected. And we rely on increasingly in the cloud to make sure that even if that data is stolen, that it can still be protected. And why is that? Is because encryption, and particularly the most powerful form of encryption, end-to-end encryption, has a couple superpowers. One, the host of that encryption doesn't actually have access to the key or an ability to get access to it, which means that if anybody gets access to the information, it just looks like gibberish. And so increasingly, folks are coming to recognize its importance. And as you mentioned, we saw this move, recommendation that everybody use end-to-end encrypted communications going forward. We also saw another announcement joint between CISA, between NSA, between FBI and other foreign governments to encrypt our internet communications as much as possible. But at the same time, we're seeing increasing threats around the globe to that very vital encryption that runs every part of our economy, and every sector depends on it. Just last week in Russia, we saw Telegram and WhatsApp. The Russian regulators tried to degrade those end-to-end encrypted services, and they stood up and they said, no, we're not going to create a backdoor for these things. Just yesterday, we saw in Switzerland, Proton Mail, which is an end-to-end encrypted email provider, announced that they're leaving Switzerland because of a law that they have. They go to this category of what they call snoopers charters, which is an effort by governments to require secret backdoors and big master keys to get access to information. And most importantly, in February was the big kahuna. In February, the Washington Post broke news that the UK had given a secret order, in this case to Apple, to create a master backdoor and master key to all cloud encrypted data. Now that wasn't just data of UK folks, that wasn't just data for countries that they may be in. That was access to all of our data. That's access to your data, and that's access to my data. Now, why do these countries want to do this kind of stuff? One, they think that it's going to help them catch more crime and tackle things. But indeed, it's easy for someone, a bad actor, to just use open source data or open source tool and re-encrypt it, and so it wouldn't be accessible anyways. I think they also argue that even if they were given a master key to all this data, they would be able to keep it safe. But there's never been a backdoor created for the good guys that doesn't get abused by the bad guys. So in this case, in the UK folks, so first off, it's secret. So none of the companies have been able to actually acknowledge that they've gotten this secret order. So we don't know how many companies in the US this may have applied to, but fortunately in the US, bipartisan members of Congress expressed outrage. Gabby, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, she stepped forward, and I think recognized that this was potentially a violation of the Cloud Act, which we had signed with UK, and I think highlighted the problem this was for every American's data. And I'm really happy to report that I just heard last night, overnight, she tweeted on X that the UK has actually decided to decline that backdoor and remove this restriction. And in her tweet, she says, well, one, she thanks the president and the vice president for helping push the UK back on this big privacy challenge. But she did so to, quote, ensure Americans' private data remains private and our constitutional rights and civil liberties are protected. I think that's exactly right. But we need more companies to step up and say that they won't create backdoors. We need more folks to stand up to these other countries as they try to put our own data at risk.
Thank you. As people in cybersecurity like to say, it's a team sport. And so when governments start working for the other side of the equation, it's hard to keep that together.
Yeah.
Jen, you bring a really interesting dynamic to this because, encryption seems like a very adult thing, if we've got these devices. But you're engaged in a lot of conversations right now about the challenges with people who want to protect children online, which is a very laudable goal, but some of the ways that they're trying to do this is actually counter to that goal, and it's harmful. And you've mentioned that, encryption is one of those areas. So can you walk us through that?
So this goes to some of the conversation that we were having in the earlier questions of many of these proposals come from the best intentions. There are people who want to do the right thing. They want to help catch child online predators, or they want to help ensure national security. But in creating these vulnerabilities, as was just said, for the good guys, you create more vulnerabilities for the bad guys, because a backdoor for the good guys never stays a backdoor for just the good guys. Additionally, in many cases, what you're seeing in some of these pushes to keep people safer, whether it's to verify identities or to verify ages, is increased data collection on an individual. We know that there are plenty of attempts to hack companies that have significant data and that have sensitive data, whether it's from a foreign adversary, such as we were talking in Salt Typhoon, or whether it's just from people who want to have that to potentially get information on other individuals. We know that it seems like every single day we see news of a data breach or of something else where sensitive information has been leaked, in part due to poor cybersecurity. Most recently, we saw this with the concerns around the data that was obtained from the dating app T, where the IDs of millions of women were being stored in an insecure manner that now made very sensitive public information, private information, publicly available on the website. So unsurprisingly, many people, whether it's in the US or around the world, are starting to ask themselves, what information do they want to share? What companies are they comfortable sharing that kind of information with? And I think this goes to the intersection of sometimes the age verification debate and the encryption debate. In some cases, we've seen youth online safety laws try and create these backdoors to encryption, as I mentioned, when it comes to an idea of law enforcement needs to go after the bad guys. But we've also seen with many of these laws calls that would require you to submit your ID to access many of the apps that we're using for day-to-day communication, whether it's an encrypted messaging service or whether it's a social media app, or whether it's even something like Spotify or YouTube. You're seeing that there are a lot more requirements to either verify your biometrics or verify your ID, particularly as we look at the UK and the Online Safety Act. And we have to consider not only what does this mean for the young people, many of whom may be still wanting to use those apps and therefore submitting this information about themselves and or their parents, But also, what does it mean for some of the most vulnerable adult users? What does it mean for political dissidents and activists who now might lose access to anonymous speech or encrypted messaging apps? What does it mean for the whistleblower or the journalistic source who's trying to share the important information about what's going on when a government has a backdoor to these encrypted messaging apps that, even if it was intended for one purpose, could easily be exploited for another? And what does it mean, for example, for an individual who's trying to escape a domestic violence situation, for whom the internet may be a literal lifeline, but for whom these same vulnerabilities could put their literal physical safety at risk?
So yesterday, Elizabeth Rossi, when she was from Google, who was talking about quantum, said that one of the best things we can do, and we have the concern about one of the things that quantum might do is break encryption, is get ahead of it, start doing the work and thinking about that. And so for a lot of the work that the people in this room do, myself included, we're always in this constant tension between what technology can do and then regulatory intent. So part of what we're seeing now, and Jen, I think you've probably got the best perspective on this, is all the patchwork of state laws that they're doing in either calling them privacy or child online safety, which are taking us the absolute opposite direction of trying to be prepared for when that quantum moment happens. We're not taking the time and the energy to be thinking that through. Instead, we're going the opposite direction. So what guidance are you giving the people in the states when you go out and talk to all the state representatives and legislatures right now?
When we talk about privacy, we're oftentimes talking about several different things. Even in a conversation like this, to the title and to your comment about kind of getting surveillance thrown into this topic, sometimes we're talking about privacy in terms of the individual's relationship to the government and some of the questions we've discussed so far around encryption and things like that. Sometimes we're also talking about individual consumer privacy choices. And most of the actions we've seen at a state level have been creating some sort of framework for those consumer choices, oftentimes preferencing particular privacy preferences or particular privacy methods that over others that may or may not reflect what an individual consumer wants and may or may not reflect the way that data security and data privacy are going to evolve. Law is static, technology is dynamic. And particularly in privacy, we're often seeing new solutions that can improve our privacy, can improve our cybersecurity, develop all the time. We're also seeing companies who are offering certain privacy features as part of how they distinguish themselves in the market and how they really seek to serve certain customer bases, and having a one-size-fits-all approach that presumes that everyone always wants the most privacy protective version over potential other issues, whether it's concerns around speech or concerns around innovation, can limit the way that we're actually able to see beneficial technology evolve, including in the privacy space. At this point, I believe we're up to 19 to 20 states that have their own consumer data privacy framework, which is confusing for consumers, particularly who might not know what their rights are or why they all of a sudden got 50 new pop-ups and now they're just tired of re-accepting the terms of service every time they log on to their website, and it hasn't meaningfully changed anything about their knowledge, but also particularly for small and mid-sized businesses who now might have to comply not only with existing laws in their industry, but with a whole plethora of laws in every state that they operate, potentially preventing them in some cases from operating nationwide. In many cases, what we actually see, particularly in the privacy space, is this kind of awful Brussels Sacramento sandwich, which is not some kind of concoction of chocolate and avocado or almonds or something, but is what happens when oftentimes companies find themselves regulated by California's laws, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, that are very detailed and and often require compliance even beyond the state's borders, as well as with a European regulation mode where that has become their greatest tech policy expert in many cases, where no longer do we necessarily see many innovative companies, but we see attempts to regulate American companies. And who actually loses out in this scenario are all of the American consumers who now are losing out on innovation as costs are put towards compliance rather than towards improving their products, as well as when we see changes that might not best be serving the consumer but are necessary merely to comply. when we're thinking about this and the potential of a state-by-state approach, I normally am a big fan of federalism. I think the states as the laboratories of democracy and governing on the most local level possible is a great thing. This is where I'm going to try and prevent myself from just fully nerding out about the Dormant Commerce Clause for half an hour. You can catch me outside in the lobby if you want to hear that full rant. But the internet by its very nature is almost always interstate. It's not, very rarely is it an intrastate issue, which means the most local level of governance, if we look at this from a constitutional perspective, is going to be a federal data privacy framework.
Jim?
And just, I so much agree with so much of what Jennifer said, right? We do need a national data privacy framework. And she was talking about the kids' sets of issues. And of course, these have always been the hardest set, but most important sets of issues we can do. And one of those is kind of a national kids' data privacy piece. But one of those things, I want to drill down a little bit into some of these, age verification bills, because I do think they create very significant privacy challenges and actually can undermine the goal that we're actually trying to achieve in protecting kids. I mean, I think overwhelmingly at Trusted Future, we did some surveys that showed that 90% of parents are absolutely concerned about protecting children's privacy, identity, and safety online. But when you look at some of those proposals, they have a number of different flaws. So in some cases, they're requiring, a third party to either collect government-issued IDs, which is exactly the problem we saw in the T breach that impacted so many women. In other cases, they're doing age estimation using facial recognition or other types of things that are not actually very accurate. And in addition to the constitutional issues in many of these cases, which I know Net Choice is here, and they've successfully pushed back in courts in many of these cases as these being unaligned with the First Amendment. But some of these proposals really put significant privacy at risk. But I'll take a couple examples. In Utah, Texas, and Louisiana, there's a set of bills, and there's a companion in the Senate as well in the House that would shift responsibility over this to app stores. It's got a number of really significant problems. First, it requires folks to share specific age of the child with not just the companies that need that data, but with all of the 4 billion apps that are out there. And they do that without requiring parental consent. One of the things we see in our survey data is parents want to be in charge of the information that gets shared about their children. And there's few controls on how that data can be used. It creates a ginormous honeypot with all of these 4 billion apps having to create these databases of private information about their kids. Instead, there's much better ways we can do this. We can use, people are developing a lot of really great tools that allow parents to choose in advance what apps they want to download, that enables them to keep control of, to choose whether or not they allow their children's private data to be shared, to use age range data, and only send it to those apps that specifically need it. There's important ways to make progress in this debate that doesn't require us to undermine privacy and safety.
Jeff, do you want to add to that?
I've got some thoughts echoing what Jim said, but first on the post-quantum encryption, the PQC is, I think, one of the biggest problems we're facing that we're not doing enough on as a government and in the private sector. When I was at NIST, we started a project looking at NIST had a separate project coming up with the new algorithms, but it was how do you deploy these? And the average data we saw was that it would take average 10 to 15 years to deploy a new algorithm. And that was when we used encryption much less broadly than now. So companies, organizations need to be working on this now. And I encourage you, if you're in a position in your company where you can say, hey, what are we doing? Ask that question, drive that change, because this could come on us more quickly than we think. Two things, though, on what Jim and Jen said. The data collected is itself a target. Bad guys are incredibly creative at finding ways to use data against individuals, against families, against business people. So it worries me when government is mandating mass collection of data, when I know from experience that it's really hard to protect that, particularly when you have companies that are often working on a shoestring budget. So I think we need to think hard before we just sit back and say, okay, this is for a public good, so it's okay to do this. We need to focus on what is the end, what do we think the actual result will be. And on that vein, the second thing, and going back to the UK law, which thankfully, Jim, I didn't even know that it sounds like they're pulling back on. My first thought when I read that, and I was fairly fresh out of government, was A, this will lead to not much actual data being shared with the government additionally, but it will lead to a significant pullback in how companies are willing to work with the government. I have yet to meet a company that wants to support criminals, wants to support child predators or terrorists. In almost every case, when I've been in a company or when I've been in different parts of the government, the companies want to help. But what they don't want to do is undermine the core security of their devices. And in most situations, most may be an overstatement, but in many situations when the government has a legal mandate or has a legal authority to get information, we do not have to resort to breaking encryption if the government engages early enough, if the company is willing to work with them. So if we create an environment where the companies are incredibly defensive because they're worried about being mandated to have a backdoor, or the government's going to use some other judicial means, ultimately, in my experience, there's a good chance it's going to lead to less cooperation and less security. So I bristle at these proposals that have these broad, what I call them fairy dust mandates, which say, okay, do a process where you can break your encryption but keep it equally secure. And math is still math. That doesn't work. So those two pieces of it, I think, we need to think about that when we go into it. And as Jen said, often really well-intentioned, but often not thinking about the practical outcomes.
Jen, you touched on this with I'm still thinking about the avocado chocolate sandwich, with what's going on in Europe. And Jim, I know you've spent a lot of time and noted concern about the Digital Markets Act and the unintended consequences that it brings to bear. So
yeah, absolutely. I think. Well, again, it's a well-intentioned piece of legislation intended to drive, more competition in Europe. But again, I think this is one of these cases where they're not looking at the privacy and security impacts. And let me give you two examples of, we know from Salt Typhoon and from all these other attacks that, one, people are using social engineering attacks to get us to act and download things we shouldn't. And we know that they're targeting, increasingly that the number one target for bad actors is phishing. And it's phishing, it's mobile phishing. As Imperium says, it's about 82%. So what the Digital Markets Act is actually requiring in security in some of the very products and services that can put things at risk. So let me give you an example. Russians have long tried to use an attack that is, if you look at your phone and you look at the little bubbles that pop up on your phone that have text messages and all these different pop-ups. One of the things Russians have been trying to do for a long time is get access to that. Why? It includes our private information, our private text messages, but our text messages also include multi-factor authentication codes from others. One of the, I'll say, crazy things that Europe is requiring folks to do is build in an insecurity into that, so that in the name of, look, they want to be able to drive device interoperability. I think that's a great goal, but they're doing this in a way that allows a third-party app to intercept all of those notifications without having it be encrypted all the way through. That's a piece of sensitive information that even your provider doesn't have access to because it's encrypted end-to-end. And there's no restrictions on how that can be used. So again, it creates a honeypot of super sensitive information, the kind that Russians have long tried to get at. Another great example, if we take a look at some of the biggest exploits that have been out there, a set of spyware, one made by a company called NSO, another set by Intellixa, which used to be Citrix. Now, these things, go to our national security experts. They go to journalists. They go to activists. They go to a whole bunch of papers to get access to everything on the phone, location, data, text. This type of spyware, commercial grade, intelligence grade spyware is particularly harmful. In the U.S., we even had an executive order to make sure that the U.S. wasn't using this. But here's the crazy thing. Again, it's buried in their stuff, but they're making, just to get totally nerdy, they're making specific changes to how browsers work. One of the most complex things within browsers is something called the JIT. It's the just-in-time compiler. When you look at, they're responsible for half of the exploits across every single browser type. And what they're effectively do is weakening that very JIT technology, which is the way that they use to get these most advanced no-click kinds of spywares on the phone. They're weakening that very type of things. Like, what could possibly go wrong? And I do look at this Digital Markets Act, and I just think it's bonkers for what it does for privacy and security. Like, they didn't even ask their security agencies to review some of this stuff. So there is this crazy, and I think that we heard some good news yesterday that hopefully these things aren't going to get replicated around the globe. But in this Brussels-Sacramento sandwich, Brussels is trying to use this Brussels effect and replicate these bad ideas around the globe. And I think it's really harmful to, in a global environment where these attacks are global, weakening something somewhere can have effects on all of us. And I think it's just a really bad, stupid idea.
Thanks. We are just under 10 minutes, so I'm going to open up for questions and be looking for things on Slido. So, Alan, start with you.
Thank you. Great presentation. You've made the connection between privacy and cybersecurity, which I think is a very fair one. I've got two follow-up questions on that. One, there is the mention of the need for federal privacy legislation to make some sense of all of the states that are going in that direction. We have 50 plus state data breach notification laws. A number of states have cybersecurity laws. Do you favor federalizing privacy, data breach notification, and cybersecurity requirements as all of that, or just privacy? Because there's it has always been controversial to federalize cybersecurity requirements for private companies. We don't have such a federal law. Second question on government surveillance and access to data. One of the really lively issues in the last 18 months has been Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act 702, which permits access to foreign data transversing U.S. networks. But it was also controversial because the FBI accessed some of that data about U.S. persons, especially after some of the Black Lives Matters protests on January 6th. It was reauthorized. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether the 702, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, concerns have now abated given that the change in administration, and also on the federalization of cybersecurity and data breach legislation.
I'll take the first if someone wants to take the second.
I also want to hop in on the first, so I'll let
You can both talk about the first.
Well, first off, on a patchwork of state laws on privacy does not make sense. We shouldn't have, parents, families, we shouldn't have to have different laws depending on where we live or what our driver's license says. On cybersecurity, I do think it's a very different thing. I think on cybersecurity, we have come to a consensus that in a global threat environment, we need to rely on global standards. And I do think that, one of the smartest things the federal government did several years ago is they created the NIST framework of using global private sector-led standards for all of cybersecurity and encouraged everybody to adopt that. That's been a huge and enormous success, and I think we should not try to codify that as a regulation, but as because in cybersecurity, threats happen in a matter of milliseconds, patches happen, in a matter of weeks, but regulatory cycles can take months or years. And so I think when we try to statically do that, or to try to micromanage how a company does their security, we run into problems.
I think for the first question, the main question comes down to, is this an intrastate or an interstate issue? So there are things where we have seen states taking positive actions, whether it has to do with law enforcement's access to data, whether it has to do with cybersecurity requirements for government data or for for municipalities within the states or their own services or things like that. Those are going to be very clearly intrastate issues. When it comes to the 50 state plus DC data breach patchwork, I think in some ways this shows an example of how it is at best a second best alternative to a federal framework when it comes to the data privacy debate. Yes, at this point, everyone is covered by a data breach notification requirement. However, they vary significantly. They vary in terms of what type of data is covered. They vary in terms of the timelines for notification. They vary in terms of what those notifications may or must contain. And this creates confusion both for consumers of you just got this thing, or maybe you shopped at Target and your friend got one and you didn't because of what state they're a resident of or the timelines or things like that, as well as the confusion for smaller players of what those compliance requirements look like, what that means in terms of if something happens in terms of the amount of time that you have to do it. So while it ultimately results in a federal data breach notification in the sense of everyone is covered, it still creates those potential concerns about, is this actually solving the problem so that consumers are aware of what their rights are, and particularly the burden it can have on small businesses.
I guess I get 702. First, I want to disagree with Jim a little bit. I do think there is a need for the federal government to weigh in particular in critical infrastructure about cybersecurity baselines. It doesn't have to be inflexible, but if you just look back, numerous studies show that regulated sectors have better security. And right now, we are in a security deficit in too many critical sectors. The government can do this through purchasing power. It can do, secure by design was a big push in the previous administration. But I do think the federal government needs to be involved. On 702, I don't think we should, we should think the concerns are abated. We should always be asking our government very hard questions about what they're doing with their authorities. With that said, this is an area where my privacy and my national security brain really crash, having been on the side of seeing the value of 702 and the really bad things that 702 has allowed us to stop that most of us will never know about. Also, having spent time with some of the people who use those authorities and seen the training that they take, definitely the FBI made some mistakes. They owned up to it. I don't think that there is a planned or consistent effort to abuse those authorities, and I think this is one of those situations where that authority is so essential to so many things that personally, I was relieved when it was reauthorized. I'd also make a quick pitch for the CISA 2015 information sharing bill that allows companies to share information with CISA with specific protections. If we lose that authority, we will lose a lot of cybersecurity benefit we get in the public-private partnership. I'll talk offline more.
Actually, this a question. That is, I believe it's up for reauthorization, right?
It is up for reauthorization. It's being held up in the Senate basically right now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's really important. Can we get a microphone up here for Steve? Steve, you have 1 minute and 50 seconds.
Thank you. Some of the net choice litigation and the potential App Store bills have another wrinkle that you haven't covered yet, and it's the notion of verifiable parental consent, so that a 17-year-old could, with her parent or guardian's permission, if she had one, could get access to social media, to YouTube and others. Does that create any additional privacy and security concerns for you, this tracking of the parent-guardian relationship?
Yes.
Yes.
Again, you're going to see additional data collection, additional sensitive data collection on adults, but also I think particularly this presumes a very traditional two-parent household where both parents agree all the time and have a very positive relationship with their 17-year-old child.
And technology.
Yeah, and are technically savvy enough and are comfortable uploading the child's birth certificate and their driver's license to the social media app and things like that. The reality is that's not a lot of households in America, or in many cases, and not even in a negative way, but a child may be being raised by a step-parent and a biological parent. A child may be in a same-sex parent household where only one parent's name is on the particular birth certificate. A child may be in foster care, or a child may be primarily residing with a grandparent, or any number of situations one can think of where verifiable parental consent is either going to be very invasive into the social situation, or is going to create a whole list of questions of who is the parent for the purpose of this type of verification and acceptability. I think the other thing we have to consider is, again, what are some of those most vulnerable situations? I used to be a upper elementary school and middle school teacher, and unfortunately there are some children where the parent is abusive, and the internet may be the lifeline where they're going to for help. And what do you do in those situations if there's not some sort of bypass, if there's not some sort of way for a child to get what may be important information, to be able to contact folks that they need to contact, to understand what's going on in those situations?
Let me add another thing that we didn't talk about, which is, I think, another challenge. Right? There's the constitutional challenges, there's the privacy challenges, but there's also kind of the economic burden. One of the things that some of these App Store age verification bills do is they shift the burden to the app developers themselves to have to implement a specific technology to be able to receive the age range data. Well, there's two fundamental problems. One, if you look at the apps themselves, 90% are small businesses. When apps they're a restaurant, they're a B2B company, they're a bike shop looking to make a rental. All of these small businesses have to update their apps. They have to go through a chain to make sure that they're complying, that they're protecting their data, which I don't know if a bike store has a really robust cybersecurity type of things. But I did some back-of-the-envelope math. So 90% of 4 billion apps times about $10,000 a piece, you end up with a $290 billion bill to a lot of companies and a lot of apps that actually don't have age-inappropriate content. And I think one of the solutions here is we should, just like an app that is a Netflix or an HBO, they've got adult content, they've got children's content. They're often the best able to, figure out how to make it appropriate for the children. I think, there's another, set of challenges, as well in terms of just how you do this. And some of these bills, they ask for a parental permission to download an app, but that's different than the requirement under COPPA, which is you have to get the parent's permission to be able to collect the data. There are two different types of parental permissions, and so it doesn't actually solve the problem that I think people are trying to solve.
We're going to have to stop there because we're running a little bit late. Thank you, the panel with me, for such an incredible conversation.